Sienna God, hello all. Osha, afternoon, good afternoon, Wado. Thank you for watching. This is day 20, part A of reading Black Rednecks and White Liberals by Thomas Sowell. Gotta bear with me because I've been dealing with some motion sickness like crazy. So I'm gonna try and do my best here, but I noticed that I got myself off on a tangent and I completely forgot to mark where I was. So when I chimed back in on my last video, I skipped a pretty long sentence. So I'll read the paragraph that goes with again. Putting aside for the moment the emotionally loaded terms of such discussions, is it in fact the case that groups which exhibit pride and identity advance faster or further than groups which see themselves as inferior in achievements, knowledge, and sophistication to some other groups whose progress they wish to emulate? Here's the part that I skipped. Ultimately, this is an empirical question and does not depend on anyone's philosophical or ideological orientation, though such orientations may make some more willing or less willing to investigate the empirical evidence. So then I'll just keep on going. Any serious investigation must begin with an understanding that we cannot see directly into the hearts and minds of other human beings. All that we can see are the outward manifestations. The simple fact must be confronted at the outset as equally applicable to those who hold one belief rather than another, rather than have it surface at the end when one set of beliefs has failed the empirical test and seeks escape by saying that we have not discussed quote-unquote real pride, or I should say quote-unquote real pride, or quote-unquote real self-hate, as they exist in the recesses of other people's minds. Now here's the stuff for today. Judging by what we can see and by what history has recorded, what is in fact the track record of breastfeeding versus the cultural, quote-unquote, cultural cringe? A definitive answer would require an encyclopedic survey of history that would take longer than anyone's lifetime. However, we get along with less than definitive answers to most of life's questions. So this is not an insuperable, yeah, I said it right, barrier to learning what we can and reaching tentative conclusions subject to later revision. Modest as this goal may be, it is better than a blind refusal to look at the facts for fear that they will undermine some cherished beliefs. Two of the most remarkable examples of dramatic advancement by whole peoples have been the Scots in the 18th century and the Japanese in the late 19th century and early 20th centuries. Both provide evidence on the issue of quote-unquote pride versus quote-unquote self-hate. Scotland. As far back as Roman times, Scotland lagged behind England, and as late as the 14th century, there was said to be no Scottish baron who could write his own name. Scottish agriculture was primitive and its industry virtually non-existent. The people were illiterate, and there was no law and order except for the arbitrary edicts of local clan chiefs. So I reckon that's where they get stuff like Peaky Blinders from. Now, I'm pretty sure I'm messing it up because I'm not sure if they're Scottish or whatever, but I'm just saying. They're not going to be the only ones, right, that ran that way. What? Could you imagine? I can't even imagine living in times like that. Man. The largest city in Scotland in the 17th century, Edinburgh, had a population of just 16,000. Part of the reason for Scotland's lag behind England was geographic isolation. Scotland was on the outer fringes of European civilization. England was closer to continental Europe, which was for centuries more advanced than the British Isles, so that cultural artifacts of a more advanced civilization found their way across the Channel to the English. But whatever the reason, the Scots lagged behind the English and were painfully aware of that fact. After centuries of conflict, the English invaded Scotland, first the lowlands and then the highlands. They conquered Scotland both militarily and culturally. Scots, in quotes, were conscious to a painful degree of their backwardness, their poverty, their lack of polish, their provinciality. End quote. Scots began to speak English, usually with a heavy accent. A society, quote unquote, end quotes, for promoting the reading and speaking of the English language, end quote, was formed, and lectures on the subject drew hundreds, was formed. for speaking English, a society for, in quotes, promoting the, I'm sorry, my daughter and my husband are texting back and forth because she's got to go get some supplies for her orientation and stuff, which is like so cool. We're just, oh my gosh. Anyway, we're over the moon on that. So let me start that sentence over. A society, in quotes, for promoting the reading and speaking of the English language, in quote, and I'm like seeing it like, and I'm like, Anyway, it's nothing I need to chime in on, so we're all right. Was formed, and lectures on the subject drew hundreds, including James Boswell. Even such an intellectual giant as David Hume, Hume, took lessons in English pronunciation, and he warned fellow Scots against using peculiarly Scottish expressions, and a warning repeated both in his letters and in Scots Magazine, SCOTS Magazine. James Mill deliberately purged his speech of Scottish pronunciation and expressions. He moved to England and raised John Stuart Mill and his other children as Englishmen, who never heard him speak of Scotland, nor was he unique. That makes me think about when, like living in a, like, okay, so the actual history and culture and stuff that you would pass on from generation to generation could essentially die out if you punish the people harshly enough over an extensive period of time by not allowing them to like excel, you know. You could stamp it out accidentally, but like, what's the way around that? I guess that's like the quadrillion-dollar question or something, because like, how do you not make them more refined? Okay, so for the lack of a better whatever, how do you remove the heathen out of them? You know what I'm talking about? Because I'm talking about the ones that like, because you know what I'm talking about. We've been reading about it in the book. You've been seeing it in real life, hearing about it and stuff. Seeing people have more animalistic instincts than actual, like, human logic, like leading with logic and things, right? They just lead with feelings and stuff. And that's like very animalistic, right? So how do you remove that out of the people, but keep their culture? Because it sounds like they didn't even want to admit that they had any Scottish ties whatsoever because they were going to get pigeonholed. You know what I mean? So like, they never even heard him speak of Scotland. So that means his father, like him, as their father, could not pass down like the non-bad stuff, if that makes sense. For example, being Cherokee, we all know that Native Americans, they did all sorts of crazy crap, okay, throughout history. Scalping, raping, murdering, all that stuff. Stealing, everything. That was not passed down. Right? Like, we're not running around, people with even a drop of, you know, Native American blood in them, they're not running around and, you know, scalping and murdering and raping and all that. Do you understand what I'm saying? So all of the heritage and stuff can be passed down. However, it was taboo for our side of the family that is Cherokee, right, to actually speak about that stuff. And I guess it's because they were so, they had it kind of beaten out of them. You know what I mean? With the schools and the, you know, the fear factor and all that kind of thing. There has to be a better way, right? Anyway, demeaning or not, the overwhelming desire to pass as English and to transcend Scottish origins was symbolic of the more pervasive fertilization of Scottish life with external influences. It eventually facilitated the universalization. Oh yeah, I said that. Wow. I just said a giant word like it was nothing. Of Scottish. Does that ever happen to y'all? Anyway, scholarship, which was the hallmark of the Enlightenment and the outreach of its own culture. Back in Scotland, Lowland Scots copied the English, and Highland Scots copied the Lowland Scots. Scottish farmers even used an English plough that was completely unsuitable for the soil of Scotland. In short, 18th century Scots represented a clear example of the quote-unquote cultural cringe. What was the result? First of all, the spread of the English language beginning in the Scottish lowlands opened a whole new world of literature and numerous fields to the Scots, fields in which there was little or no literature in the indigenous Gaelic language. Education caught on so widely in the Scottish lowlands that they had compulsory education before England did, and developed the most extensive system of schools in Europe. Not only an educated class, but an intellectual class developed in Scotland. As a distinguished historian put it, in quotes, in every branch of knowledge, this once poor and ignorant people produced original and successful thinkers, end quote. From the middle of the 18th century to the middle of the 19th century, most of the leading British intellectual figures were either from Scotland or of Scottish ancestry. These included David Hume in philosophy, Adam Smith in economics, Joseph Black in chemistry, Robert Adam in architecture, James Watt in engineering, Sir Walter Scott in literature, and John Stuart Mill in economics, philosophy, and political science. In medicine, Scots likewise moved to the forefront, not only in Britain but also in Russia, where Catherine the Great had a Scottish physician, and in America, where Scots established some of the earliest medical schools. Scots also set the world standard in engineering in general and shipbuilding in particular. By 1871, nearly half the ships built in Great Britain were built in Scotland. Scottish universities surged ahead of English universities in science and engineering. In short, the Scots eventually surpassed those from whom they had once learned. Japan. The isolation which has often kept some societies lagging far behind others was self-imposed isolation for Japan. From 1638 to 1868, immigration from Japan was forbidden on pain of death, and foreigners and foreign trade and foreign cultures were kept out. In short, Japan was one of the most self-insulated countries in history and was also very poor and backward. Now, I think that it is still very difficult to get into Japan as far as to gain citizenship. Excuse me. I don't know how difficult it is to live there. Excuse me. I've only ever lived in Okinawa, Japan, and that was because I was in the Marine Corps. So, clearly, like, I didn't have to go through any of that paperwork or whatever it is that you have to, all the hoops you have to jump through in order to get into the country, aside from vacation. You know what I mean? Excuse me. All right. This era ended dramatically when American warships under the command of Commodore Matthew Perry entered Japanese waters in 1854 and demanded that Japan open its ports to the outside world. Helpless in the face of such overwhelming modern force, Japan had no choice but to submit to this demand. It was a turning point in the century's history. This painful demonstration of Japan's weakness and backwardness before its own people and before the world set in motion internal reforms and an agenda for national development that dominated the country's history for the next century. Japan's leaders in that era held up the West in general and the United States in particular and as examples to be emulated. Western technology was imported and Japanese students were sent to study in the West. The English language began to be taught in Japanese schools, and there was even a suggestion at one point that English be made the national language of Japan. I don't like that. I mean, I kind of feel like if you're going to go to another country, you gotta learn the language, right? You gotta learn the basics to get you around and to have, like, conversations that you can build on, and then but also get done what you need to get done. Do you know what I mean? I don't think that they need to be made to learn our language unless they're going to be doing business with us. Then those people will, like, it should be like an elective, you know what I mean? Like French, German, Italian, Spanish. Those were electives when I was going to school, right? What was it? I think eighth grade, we started taking another language. And then we had to take it for however many years after that. But yeah. And then, of course, if they come to live here or go to school here, yes, I believe it should be a requirement that they learn the language. Like, they go, if they're like, oh, I want to do abroad, right? I want to go to school abroad. Okay, cool. You take a year of English. There you go, right? Anyway. An episode shortly after Americans forced Japan to open up to the outside world illustrates, let me see, an episode shortly, The situation at that time, Commodore Perry presented a train as a gift, and the Americans proceeded to demonstrate it. At first, the Japanese watched the train fearfully from a safe distance, and when the engine began to move, they uttered cries of astonishment and drew in their breath. Before long, they were inspecting it closely, stroking it and riding on it, and they kept this up throughout the day. I bet they did. That had to be like such a foreign concept. Like if you just saw a flying saucer right now, right? And it landed in your yard, or it just like went right down the street, and then it came back and then it stopped and you're able to go up. I don't recommend touching those, but I'm just saying. But like, you know what I mean? Like that would just be like, wow. No one could have predicted then that a century later, Japan would produce its own quote-unquote bullet train that surpassed anything available in the United States. But it happened only because the Japanese recognized their own initial backwardness and were determined to overcome it. Yeah, there's that drive, right? They began by learning instead of just, ugh, woe is me, right? There's a drive like, no, I want to learn more, I want to grow and all that. They began by learning all that they could from the West and emulating the West until they reached the point when they had amassed the knowledge, skill, and experience to take their own independent direction. In the first half of the 20th century, Japanese products were widely known as cheap, inferior imitations of European or American products, even after Japan later began to produce higher quality products such as cameras. The first Canon, C-A-N-O-N, was an imitation of the German Leica, L-E-I-C-A, and the first Nikon, Nikon, was an imitation of its German rival Contax, C-O-N-T-A-X. Over time, however, these and other Japanese cameras evolved into the leading cameras in the world, both technologically and in terms of sales. Similarly, spectacular developments occurred when the Japanese entered the electronics, automotive, and other fields. Black Americans. Against the background of the history of Scotland and Japan, today's assumptions about the effects of quote-unquote pride and quote-unquote self-hate as factors in progress are hard to sustain. Against the history of blacks in the United States, many other assumptions are equally hard to sustain. The history of the black population of the United States might be summed up in broad outlines as follows. Sold into slavery by African leaders at a time when slavery was widely accepted. In all civilizations, blacks entered a particular segment of American society and culture at the bottom, acquiring only the rudiments of Western civilization, not including literacy, in most cases in a way of life influenced by a peculiar redneck culture. Freed after the Civil War, but poverty-stricken, of life in... Hold on. Nope, I skipped a sentence. Man, my eyes were just like, whoa. And I was like, whoa, wait a minute. And I tried to focus back, and I'm like, ugh. It's not that I can't focus. It's just my nausea. It's just it's like, the only way I can describe it is motion sickness. That's it. There's just like a little movement. I'm like, my head's like, whoa. All right, freed after the Civil War, but poverty-stricken, illiterate, unskilled, and unacculturated to the demanding way of life in a free public with a market economy, blacks began their history a free people at the bottom of American society. One sign of their lack of preparation for life as a free people was a rate of mortality among blacks in the aftermath of emancipation that was greater than it had been under slavery. This was just one sign of a more general lag in adjusting to the norms of society around them. The small enclaves of New England culture transplanted among blacks via Oberlin College and Dunbar High School, as well as in black colleges established in the South by New Englanders, did not promote pride in the existing black redneck culture. Well, that's good. On the contrary, the clear message in these enclaves was that the way most blacks talked, the way they behaved, and the whole set of redneck values they inherited, were all wrong and were things to be overcome. The wholly disproportionate number of black leaders and high achievers who came out of these small enclaves is further evidence in the case of quote-unquote pride versus quote-unquote self-hate. Among both blacks and white liberals, there were those who thought that cultural changes among blacks were unnecessary and that there could be progress without internal cultural change, effects without causes. In the post-1960s world, such views gained the ascendancy, and those who held these views often wondered why it was so hard to raise ghetto blacks out of poverty and social disintegration. Their answer was usually a call for more welfare state programs, more quote-unquote pride, and quote-unquote self-esteem. more steeping in the history and Black achievement of white injustice. The actual track, oh, I'm over.